What if I told you that the chocolate bar in a man's pocket literally changed how you cook your food forever? That a bored shepherd throwing rocks at a cave wall accidentally unlocked the oldest secrets of the Bible? And that a teenage boy who forgot a stick in a cup of juice on a cold night invented something you probably had last summer? And every single one of these was a total accident that almost never happened? Humanity has been stumbling into genius for thousands of years, and today we are covering 111 of the most jaw-dropping accidental discoveries that changed everything. So if your mind is already spinning, smash that hype button right now and share this video because trust us, it only gets wilder from here. 1. A man went on vacation and left a dirty petri dish sitting in his sink like a college freshman who swears he will clean it later. That man was Alexander Fleming in 1928. And when he came back from his trip, he found mold had completely taken over his dish and was straight up murdering all the bacteria around it. Fleming stared at it, and instead of being disgusted, he got excited. That lazy cleanup accidentally gave the world penicillin and saved over 200 million lives. 2. Roy Plunkett at DuPont in 1938 was messing around with refrigerant gases when one of his canisters just stopped working and refused to dispense anything. A normal person throws it in the trash and moves on with their life. Plunkett grabbed a saw and cut the canister completely open, like a man with zero chill. Inside was a weird, slippery white powder that had formed on its own. That strange powder turned out to be the most slippery solid on Earth, and it now coats every single non-stick pan in every American kitchen. 3. Hans Christian Ørsted in 1820 was just doing a normal classroom lecture when he casually placed a compass next to a wire carrying electrical current. The needle moved. Ørsted stood there in front of his students looking like a man who just accidentally won the lottery during a boring Tuesday. He had just discovered that electricity and magnetism were the same force. That one twitching compass needle became the foundation of every motor, generator, and transformer ever built on this planet. 4. Clyde Tombaugh in 1930 had the most painfully boring job at the entire observatory. His assignment was staring at photographic plates all day, comparing tiny star positions looking for anything that moved slightly between two images. Everyone considered it the worst job in astronomy. Then one faint little dot shifted position between two plates, and Tombaugh nearly fell out of his chair. He had just found a brand new planet, while doing the job that literally nobody else wanted to do. 5. Back in 1987, biologists kept noticing these weird repetitive sequences scattered throughout bacterial DNA, and everybody just shrugged and called it genetic noise. Scientists ignored it for decades like a strange noise in your car, you just turn the radio up to cover. Then in 2012, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier finally looked closer and realized bacteria had been storing memories of every virus that ever attacked them. That ignored junk DNA became CRISPR, the most powerful genetic editing tool ever created. 6. French soldiers in 1799 were demolishing an old wall near Rashid, Egypt, to expand a military fort. And one soldier named Pierre-François Bouchard noticed something strange about one particular stone. It had 3 completely different scripts carved into it. Every other soldier would have kept swinging the hammer. Bouchard stopped and flagged it immediately. That single stone turned out to be the Rosetta Stone, and it cracked open 1,400 years worth of unreadable Egyptian hieroglyphics that historians had been completely stumped by. 7. Ruth Wakefield in 1930 was baking butterdrop cookies at her Toll House Inn in Massachusetts when she reached for Baker's chocolate and realized she was completely out. She grabbed a Nestlé chocolate bar, broke it into chunks, threw it into the dough, and fully expected it to melt and blend in like normal. It did not melt. It held its shape and stayed chunky throughout the entire cookie. The customer who ate it lost their mind over it. Ruth had just invented the chocolate chip cookie by running out of the right ingredient. 8. Alexander Graham Bell in 1876 was not trying to invent the telephone at all. He was trying to send multiple telegraph signals down a single wire at the same time. His assistant Thomas Watson was in another room tightening a screw when he accidentally plucked a small metal reed way too hard. Bell heard the full, rich sound travel through the wire all the way to his room. He immediately understood that if sound could travel through wire, then human voice could too. One accidentally plucked reed changed every form of human communication forever. 9. In the 1600s, a Spanish countess named Ana de Osorio, in Peru, got absolutely wrecked by a fever that nobody could cure. Local indigenous healers handed her bark from a cinchona tree growing nearby and told her to try it. The bark worked, and the fever broke completely. The active compound inside that bark was quinine, and it quietly became the entire world's primary weapon against malaria for over 300 years. One sick noblewoman and one local tree basically saved hundreds of millions of lives across the globe. 10. Wilhelm Röntgen, in 1895, was running experiments in his darkened lab when he noticed a fluorescent screen on the other side of the room randomly glowing, even though nothing was pointed at it. He walked over confused. He held his hand up between the tube and the screen and watched in pure shock as the bones inside his own living hand appeared projected on the surface in front of him. He had no idea what these rays were, so he literally called them X-rays because he had zero explanation. The man accidentally saw his own skeleton and changed medicine forever. 11. Spencer Silver at 3M in 1968 was trying to create the strongest adhesive ever made for aircraft construction. He made the exact opposite. His adhesive was so weak, it peeled off cleanly every single time and left absolutely zero residue behind. Silver told his colleagues about it, and everyone just stared at him blankly for 6 years. Then his co-worker, Art Fry, got frustrated one Sunday at church when his bookmark kept falling out of his hymn book. He remembered Silver's useless glue, lost the post-it note, was born inside a church pew. 12. Henri Becquerel, in 1896, had a whole experiment planned to prove that sunlight caused uranium to emit X-rays. Then, the weather in Paris turned completely overcast and ruined everything. He left his uranium sitting on top of a wrapped photographic plate in a dark drawer and waited for the sun to come back. When he finally developed the plate anyway just to check, the uranium had completely exposed it with zero sunlight involved at all. Becquerel had just discovered that atoms spontaneously emit energy on their own, and the cloudy French weather accidentally changed all of physics. 13. Jocelyn Bell, in 1967, was grinding through mountains of radio telescope data looking for quasars when she spotted a signal so perfectly timed and precise it looked completely impossible. Her supervisor jokingly suggested they should name it LGM1 for Little Green Men, because nothing natural should pulse that consistently. It turned out to be a rotating neutron star called a pulsar. Bell had discovered one of the most exotic objects in the universe while doing routine data analysis. Her supervisor collected the Nobel Prize for the discovery. Jocelyn Bell did not receive it. 14. Stanley Prusiner in the early 1980s was investigating a mysterious sheep disease called scrapie and kept coming up completely empty. No bacteria, no virus, no living organism of any kind, just a single misfolded protein causing pure destruction. The entire global scientific community told him directly that a protein alone could not possibly be infectious because that violated every known rule of biology. Prusiner ignored all of them and kept going. In 1997, he won the Nobel Prize, proving every single one of those scientists completely wrong. The man they laughed at changed medicine forever. 15. A bored teenage shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib was watching his goats near Qumran in 1947 when he got so restless he started throwing rocks into a nearby cave just to pass the time. One rock went in, and he heard pottery shatter inside. He climbed down to investigate and found sealed clay jars sitting in the dark. Inside those jars were 900 ancient scrolls dating back to 300 BC, containing the oldest known biblical manuscripts ever found. The most significant religious discovery in modern history happened because a teenager was bored and had good aim. 16. John and Will Kellogg at the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1894 were so busy running their health facility that they left a pot of boiled wheat sitting on the kitchen counter completely overnight by accident. When they came back the next morning and tried to roll it into dough, it had dried out and crumbled into individual flakes. They shrugged and baked it anyway because wasting food was not an option. Their patients actually liked the flakes. The brothers had just stumbled backwards into inventing breakfast cereal and an entire industry worth billions of dollars today. 17. Australian astronomer John O'Sullivan, in the 1990s, was trying to detect incredibly faint radio waves coming from exploding miniature black holes deep in space. The experiment failed completely and produced nothing useful at all. Nay, but the signal-cleaning algorithm O'Sullivan had invented specifically to filter out interference and sharpen weak radio signals was quietly extraordinary. That failed space experiment algorithm became the core mathematical engine powering modern Wi-Fi. Every single person in America who has ever complained about their Wi-Fi being slow owes that complaint to a completely unsuccessful black hole experiment. 18. Humphrey Davy, in 1799, was studying nitrous oxide gas in his lab and decided the most logical next step was to just inhale some of it personally. He immediately noticed it completely eliminated the throbbing toothache that had been torturing him all day. He wrote in his notes that this gas could be used to eliminate pain during surgical operations. Surgeons read his suggestion and ignored it completely for 45 straight years before anyone bothered to act on it. Davy had the answer to one of surgery's greatest cruelties sitting in his notes, and the medical world just left it there. 19. In 1889, two doctors named Minkowski and von Mering at the University of Strasbourg removed a dog's pancreas entirely just to study how digestion worked. A few days later, a lab assistant noticed flies swarming aggressively around the dog's urine on the floor. Somebody tested the urine and found it was loaded with sugar. The doctors had accidentally created diabetes in the dog by removing its pancreas and had just revealed for the very first time that the pancreas controls blood sugar entirely. A swarm of flies around dog urine unlocked the path to discovering insulin. 20. The French chemist Edouard Benedictus, in 1903, was working in his lab when he knocked a glass flask off a high shelf and it smashed onto the floor. He braced for a mess of sharp shards everywhere. Instead, the glass shattered, but stayed completely together in one piece like it refused to fall apart. The flask had previously contained a dried cellulose nitrate solution coating the inside. Years later, Benedictus read about car accident victims being sliced by flying windshield glass and immediately remembered that flask. He invented laminated safety glass, and it is now in every single car windshield on Earth. 21. Heike Kamerlingh Onnes, in 1911, was cooling mercury down to temperatures so close to absolute zero that his entire laboratory was basically the coldest place on Earth. He fully expected the electrical resistance of the mercury to gradually decrease the colder it got. At one precise temperature, something completely unexpected happened. The resistance did not decrease gradually. It vanished entirely and instantly like someone flipped a switch. Onnes had just discovered superconductivity, the ability of materials to carry electricity with absolutely zero energy loss, and the entire field of quantum physics got a brand new mystery to chase. 22. Giuseppe Piazzi. On New Year's Day, 1801, was doing the most unglamorous job in astronomy, correcting errors in a star catalog, when he noticed a faint object that kept changing position from one night to the next. He assumed he had found a new planet sitting between Mars and Jupiter and got very excited. It turned out to be Ceres, to the largest object in the asteroid belt. Piazzi had accidentally discovered an entirely new category of solar system object while doing routine clerical corrections on the very first night of the entire 19th century. 23. In the 1990s, a macaque monkey sitting in a lab at the University of Parma was wired up to electrodes monitoring its motor neurons while it rested completely still. A researcher walked over and reached out to grab a piece of food sitting nearby. The monkey had not moved a single muscle, but its motor neurons fired anyway, exactly as if the monkey itself had reached for the food. The scientists stared at each other in stunned silence. They had accidentally discovered mirror neurons, the biological system behind human empathy, imitation, and social understanding, all because a monkey watched someone grab a snack. 24. In March 1974, a group of farmers near Xi'an, China were drilling a new well because they desperately needed water for their crops. Their tools hit something hard underground that was definitely not rock. They pulled up broken pottery fragments and then an actual life-sized clay soldier's head staring back at them from the dirt. Excavations that followed revealed an underground army of over 8,000 individual terracotta figures that had been buried for 2,200 years, guarding the tomb of China's first emperor. The greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century was found by farmers who just needed water. 25. John Pemberton, in 1886, was mixing up what he called a medicinal nerve tonic in Atlanta, using coca leaves and cola nuts stirred into plain water. A pharmacist at his shop was filling a customer's order and accidentally grabbed carbonated water from the wrong tap instead of still water. The customer took one sip of the fizzy version and immediately wanted more. Pemberton tasted it himself and realized the carbonated version was dramatically better than his original formula. Coca Cola, the most recognized beverage brand in all of human history, was created entirely because one pharmacist grabbed the wrong water tap. 26. Nicephore Niepce. In 1826 had no grand scientific plan and no theory he was trying to prove. He simply coated a pewter plate with bitumen, placed it inside a wooden box with a tiny pinhole drilled in one end, pointed it out of his upstairs window and walked away for 8 full hours. When he came back and processed the plate, he found a blurry but completely real image of the rooftops outside his window, captured purely by sunlight. He had just created the world's first permanent photograph entirely out of curiosity with no blueprint and no instruction manual. 27. Dr. Stuart Adams spent years developing ibuprofen as a serious anti-inflammatory medication for arthritis patients. Then one morning in 1971, he woke up absolutely destroyed by a crippling hangover the day of an important public speech he had to deliver. In a moment of desperation, he took an experimental dose of his own drug that had not yet been fully approved for general use. The hangover evaporated completely. Adams stood up straight, delivered his speech perfectly, and immediately went back to his lab to expand testing of ibuprofen as a general painkiller. A hangover cure accidentally unlocked a drug now taken by millions daily. 28. On October 16, 1846, Surgeon William Morton at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston put a patient completely under using sulfuric ether before removing a neck tumor. Every doctor and medical student packed into the observation gallery above fully expected to hear screaming the moment the scalpel touched skin. The room stayed completely silent throughout the entire procedure. The patient felt nothing. A Boston newspaper the very next day declared that humanity had conquered pain. One operation in one room on one autumn morning ended thousands of years of patients being conscious and screaming through every surgery ever performed. 29. Konstantin Fahlberg in 1879 spent a full day at Johns Hopkins reacting coal tar derivatives in his chemistry lab, and then walked straight to dinner without washing his hands because apparently that was just how things went in 1879. He picked up his bread and took a bite, and nearly choked because it tasted shockingly and inexplicably sweet. He traced the sweetness all the way back to a compound sitting in his lab. Fahlberg had accidentally invented saccharin, the world's first artificial sweetener. He then quietly patented the discovery entirely in his own name, without crediting his research partner at all. 30. Charles Goodyear. In 1839 had been obsessing for years over how to make rubber useful in both hot and cold weather, because natural rubber melted in summer and cracked in winter. One day, he was handling a mixture of rubber and sulfur when he accidentally dropped a lump of it directly onto a hot stove. Every previous rubber experiment had turned into a useless melted puddle at that temperature. This time, the rubber charred slightly, but stayed completely flexible and strong. Goodyear had solved rubber's greatest weakness by dropping it on a stove by accident, and the entire modern tire industry followed directly from that clumsy moment. 31. William Herschel, in 1800, was carefully measuring the temperature of each individual color in the visible light spectrum by placing thermometers under different colored bands of light spread across his table. He placed one final thermometer just beyond the red end of the spectrum, where there was absolutely no visible light whatsoever, just to use it as a control reading. So that thermometer registered the highest temperature of the entire experiment. Herschel stared at it completely baffled. He had just discovered infrared radiation, an entirely invisible form of light that nobody had suspected existed and that now powers every TV remote on Earth. 32. James Christie, in 1978, was examining blurry photographic plates of Pluto at the U.S. Naval Observatory when he noticed a strange bump sitting on one side of the planet's image that should not have been there. Every single colleague he showed it to immediately said it was just a defect in the photographic plate and told him to move on. Christie refused to accept that explanation and kept insisting the bump moved between different images. He was right. That bump was Charon, Pluto's largest moon, nearly half the size of Pluto itself. Discovered because one stubborn scientist refused to believe a smudge was just a smudge. 33. In the 1920s, cattle on farms across Canada began mysteriously bleeding to death after even the most minor routine procedures, and nobody could figure out why. Veterinarian Frank Schofield eventually traced the deaths back to moldy sweet clover hay the cattle had been eating. Biochemist Carl Link at the University of Wisconsin then spent years isolating the exact compound responsible. That deadly livestock mystery eventually produced warfarin, one of the most widely prescribed blood-thinning medications in all of human history. Millions of heart patients today owe their lives to a bunch of Canadian cows that kept dying in very suspicious circumstances. 34. An American historian, Hiram Bingham, in 1911, trekked into the Peruvian jungle specifically searching for Vilcabamba, the legendary lost final capital of the Inca Empire. A local farmer named Melchor Arteaga offered to guide him up a nearby mountain for a tiny fee. Bingham agreed and climbed to the top expecting to find ruins of the city he was looking for. What he found instead was an entirely different and completely unknown Inca city of breathtaking scale sitting hidden in the clouds. Bingham had gone looking for one lost city and accidentally stumbled onto a completely different and far more magnificent one instead. 35. de Dom Perignon was the cellar master at Hautevillers Abbey in France in the late 1600s, and he spent the better part of his entire career in a state of constant frustration trying to stop his wine from re-fermenting inside sealed bottles and exploding in his cellar. The problem was the second fermentation kept producing bubbles he absolutely could not eliminate no matter what he tried. He never fully solved the problem. The bubbles he fought his entire working life eventually became the defining feature of champagne. Now, the most celebrated drink on earth, poured at every wedding, championship, and New Year's Eve party in America. 36. Richard James was a naval engineer in 1943 testing tension springs designed to keep sensitive ship instruments stable at sea when he accidentally knocked one off a high shelf during an experiment. Or instead of just dropping straight to the floor like a normal spring, it walked gracefully end over end down a stack of books and landed perfectly upright. James stood there watching it with his mouth open. His wife Barbara named it the Slinky after looking through a dictionary for the perfect word. On their very first day of sales at a Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia, they sold 400 units in 90 minutes flat. 37. Scottish naval surgeon James Lind in 1747 was aboard HMS Salisbury, watching sailors drop one by one from scurvy, a disease that was rotting their gums and killing them slowly at sea. In desperation, he divided 6 sailors into groups and gave each group a different food supplement almost randomly. The 2 sailors he gave oranges and lemons to recovered within days, while everyone else stayed sick. Lind had accidentally conducted one of the earliest controlled medical trials in history and discovered that vitamin C prevents scurvy, all while floating in the middle of the ocean with a crew that was falling apart around him. 38. Jacques Brandenburger, in 1900, was sitting in a French restaurant watching a waiter mop up a wine spill from a tablecloth and became completely fixated on the idea of inventing a waterproof coating for fabric so spills would never be a problem again. He developed a viscose coating and applied it to cloth, but it made the fabric so stiff and rigid it was completely unwearable and totally useless. However, the thin, transparent film kept peeling cleanly off the fabric on its own. Brandenburger spent the next 10 years perfecting that unwanted peeling byproduct and called it cellophane, are now wrapping food in kitchens across the entire world. 39. Enrico Fermi in the 1930s was bombarding uranium with neutrons in his lab, specifically trying to create new, heavier artificial elements beyond uranium on the periodic table. He successfully created elements 93 and 94, but kept getting several strange, lighter byproducts from his experiments that he could not identify or explain. He filed them away as confusing anomalies and moved on. Scientists, examining his work years later, realized those mysterious lighter byproducts had roughly half the mass of uranium. Fermi had split the atom completely without realizing it, and had been sitting on the discovery of nuclear fission the entire time without knowing. 40. Fritz Zwicky, in 1933, was measuring how fast galaxies in the Coma cluster were orbiting around each other, and the numbers he kept getting made absolutely no sense. The galaxies were moving so fast that the total visible mass of everything in the cluster could not possibly generate enough gravity to hold them together. They should have flown apart long ago. Zwicky calculated there had to be enormous invisible mass present that nobody could see or detect. He called it Dunkel Materie, dark matter. Astronomers ignored his conclusion for decades. Today we know dark matter makes up 85% of all matter in the entire universe. 41. Paleontologist Barnum Brown in 1931 was hunting for Tenontosaurus fossils in Wyoming when his team unearthed bones of a completely unknown carnivorous dinosaur. Brown filed the discovery away without much excitement and moved on. 3 decades later, John Ostrom re-examined those same bones and proved this creature was a fast, agile, bird-like predator that completely rewrote everything scientists believed about dinosaur behavior. The discovery that modern birds descended from dinosaurs sat forgotten in a storage drawer for 30 years, because one paleontologist was too focused on finding something else. 42. In September 1944, French teenagers near Lascaux were chasing a dog that had fallen into a sinkhole in the woods. They climbed down to rescue it and found themselves standing inside a cave covered floor to ceiling with paintings of horses, bulls, and deer. The artwork was 17,000 years old, and those 4 kids had stumbled into the oldest art gallery on Earth while chasing their dog through the forest. An animal falling into a hole accidentally preserved humanity's most extraordinary prehistoric creative achievement for every generation that followed. 43. A Dutch shipmaster in the 16th century was concentrating wine by heating it to reduce its volume for easier transport across the ocean, planning to add water back once he arrived. His sailors got curious mid-voyage and tasted the concentrated liquid before it could be diluted. They immediately refused to let anyone water it down. The crew had accidentally discovered that reduced heated wine was dramatically superior to the original. They called it brandewine, meaning burned wine. That shipmaster's practical transportation trick accidentally invented brandy and changed drinking culture across the entire world forever. 44. E.A. Johnson at the Royal Radar Establishment in England in the 1960s was researching capacitive sensors purely for radar equipment applications. He realized during his experiments that these sensors could detect the precise position of a human fingertip resting on a flat surface. Johnson wrote a technical paper describing this principle in 1965 and submitted it quietly. That paper described the exact fundamental technology behind every smartphone touchscreen in existence today. He figured out how touchscreens work 40 years before smartphones were invented, and nobody outside radar research paid any attention to him at all. 45. French surgeon André Journeau in the 1950s was performing an unrelated operation on a deaf patient when a bare electrical wire accidentally made contact with the patient's auditory nerve during the procedure. The patient suddenly said out loud that he could hear sound. Journeau stopped everything and recognized immediately what had just happened. He spent the following years deliberately investigating that accidental moment of electrical contact. His research into electrical stimulation of the auditory nerve became the foundational principle behind the modern cochlear implant, now restoring hearing to deaf people around the entire world. 46. Wilson Greatbatch in 1956 was building a device designed to record heart rhythms when he reached into his parts box for a specific resistor and grabbed completely the wrong size by mistake. He installed it anyway and switched the circuit on. Instead of recording anything, the circuit began producing steady rhythmic electrical pulses at exactly the natural rate of a human heartbeat. Greatbatch sat very still and stared at what he had just accidentally built. That one wrong resistor grabbed from the wrong section of a parts box became the implantable cardiac pacemaker now keeping millions of hearts beating every day. 47. Harry Brearley in Sheffield in 1913 was testing different steel alloys, trying to develop a harder material specifically for gun barrels. Every failed experimental sample got tossed into a growing scrap pile in the corner of his workshop. Weeks later, Brearley walked past and noticed every single alloy in that pile had rusted and corroded, except one lone sample sitting cleanly in the middle. On that sample was a chromium iron alloy. Brearley had discovered stainless steel inside a rejected scrap heap that he almost never looked at twice. It now coats every kitchen sink and surgeon's scalpel on Earth. 48. Percy Spencer was a Raytheon engineer in 1946. Walking past a magnetron vacuum tube, he was testing for radar systems when he felt unusual warmth near his chest. He reached into his shirt pocket and found the chocolate bar he had brought for a snack had melted into a complete mess. Spencer immediately grabbed some popcorn kernels and held them near the magnetron. They popped everywhere across the lab floor. He had just invented the microwave oven while testing radar equipment. The first commercial model weighed 750 pounds and stood nearly 6 feet tall. Americans now own over 90 million of them. 49. In 1964, Bell Labs engineers Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson were calibrating a large radio antenna in New Jersey for satellite communication when they kept picking up a faint, irritating hiss coming equally from every single direction in the sky. They checked everything repeatedly. They even climbed inside the antenna and scraped off pigeon droppings thinking birds were causing interference. The hiss remained completely unchanged. That stubborn hiss turned out to be the afterglow radiation left over from the Big Bang itself. Two engineers trying to clean up a satellite signal accidentally confirmed the entire origin story of the universe. 50. Physiologist Charles Richet in 1902 was trying to immunize dogs against sea anemone toxin by giving them carefully spaced repeat doses, expecting protection to build each time. And the second dose nearly killed every single dog instantly instead of protecting them at all. Richet was horrified and deeply confused. He had accidentally discovered that the immune system can catastrophically overreact to a second exposure rather than fight it off better. He named the phenomenon anaphylaxis. That terrifying result in a Paris laboratory founded the entire modern science of allergies and became one of the most important accidental discoveries in all of medicine. 51. In 1594, workers digging a canal near Naples struck ancient walls and colorful mosaics buried 20 feet underground. They noted it carefully in their records and then kept digging the canal because a canal was what they were paid to dig. The significance of what they found was completely ignored for 150 more years, so systematic excavations finally began in 1748 and revealed an entire Roman city frozen perfectly in the exact moment Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. Workers found a buried civilization and just kept shoveling because nobody told them to stop and look closer. 52. Chef George Crumb, in 1853 at Moon's Lake House in Saratoga Springs, New York, kept receiving complaints from one particularly annoying customer who sent his fried potatoes back repeatedly saying they were too thick and too soggy. Crumb eventually lost his patience completely. He sliced potatoes so thin they were nearly transparent, fried them until they were bone dry, and buried them in salt to make them deliberately unpleasant. The customer took one bite and declared them absolutely perfect. And Crumb had invented the potato chip in a moment of pure frustrated spite. And the snack industry has never been the same. 53. In September 1947, operators of the Harvard Mark II computer reported a malfunction, and engineers opened up Relay 70 Panel F to investigate. Inside the relay, they found an actual moth physically wedged into the machinery and causing the entire problem. Grace Hopper carefully removed it and taped it into the maintenance logbook with a handwritten note, reading first actual case of bug being found. That single trapped moth permanently gifted the entire field of computing with the word debugging. Every programmer in America who has ever said they are debugging their code owes that phrase to one unfortunate insect. 54. Say Felix Hoffmann synthesized aspirin in 1897, originally as a pain reliever for arthritis. And nobody suspected it had any other significant properties for decades. Then, in the 1950s, physician Lawrence Craven started noticing that patients who had tonsillectomies and chewed aspirin, laced chewing gum afterward, were bleeding far more heavily than they should have been after surgery. That alarming pattern made him investigate further. Craven had stumbled onto aspirin's powerful blood-thinning ability through a very concerning post-surgery observation. That accidental finding eventually turned aspirin into the world's leading heart attack prevention drug, taken by tens of millions of Americans every single day. 55. D. Edward Jenner. In 1796, noticed something that every other doctor had completely overlooked, despite it being right in front of them for years. The milkmaids who worked daily with cows and regularly caught cowpox from them never seemed to catch smallpox, which was devastating entire communities across Europe at the time. Jenner deliberately infected a young boy with cowpox and then exposed him directly to smallpox. The boy stayed completely healthy. Jenner had created the world's very first vaccine by paying attention to women who worked with cows while every other physician walked straight past the same obvious pattern without noticing. 56. Alfred Nobel in the 1860s was losing his mind trying to make nitroglycerin stable enough to transport without it randomly exploding and killing everyone nearby. During one shipment, a can of nitroglycerin leaked and soaked into the Kieselguhr packing material surrounding it inside the crate. Nobel tested the soaked material expecting disaster and found it was completely stable yet still fully explosive when detonated intentionally. He had found his answer hiding inside a shipping accident. Nobel patented dynamite, became extraordinarily wealthy, then spent the rest of his life feeling guilty about it, and eventually created the Nobel Peace Prize to compensate. 57. Carl Anderson, in 1932, was photographing cosmic rays passing through a cloud chamber at Caltech, when he noticed one particular particle track curving in completely the wrong direction inside his magnetic field. It was identical in mass to an electron, but curved the opposite way, meaning it carried the opposite electrical charge. Anderson stared at it for a long time before accepting what it meant. He had just accidentally detected the first particle of antimatter ever observed by any human being. The universe apparently had a mirror image version of itself made of opposite matter, and Anderson found it while taking routine photographs. 58. Dutch-American astronomer Martin Schmidt, in 1963, was completely baffled by an extraordinarily bright radio source called 3C273 that matched absolutely nothing in any known catalog of stars or galaxies. When he finally decoded its spectral lines, he realized the hydrogen signatures were shifted so massively toward the red end of the spectrum that this object had to be billions of light years away. Something that far away and still that blindingly bright had to be radiating more energy than an entire galaxy combined. Schmidt had just discovered quasars, the most luminous objects in the entire universe, by decoding one deeply confusing spectrum. 59. Werner Arber, in the 1960s, was simply trying to understand why bacteria kept destroying the DNA of viruses that infected them. He discovered that bacteria produce special enzymes that cut foreign viral DNA apart at very specific sequences like molecular scissors protecting the cell. Arber was studying basic bacterial immunity with no larger ambition in mind. Those bacterial scissors he discovered became restriction enzymes, the single most fundamental tool in all of biotechnology. Every genetically modified organism, every DNA fingerprint, and every modern vaccine development process depends directly on a defense mechanism Arber found while watching bacteria fight off viruses. 60. Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s was openly mocked by every professional archaeologist alive for believing that Homer's Iliad was describing a real historical city rather than pure poetic fiction. He ignored all of them completely and picked a site at Hisarlik in Turkey based entirely on his personal reading of an ancient epic poem. He started digging and found not one but 9 successive ancient cities stacked directly on top of each other. One of those layers was almost certainly the real Troy. The man every expert laughed at proved them all wrong by trusting a 3,000-year-old story more than their professional opinions. 61. New York tea merchant Thomas Sullivan in 1908 started sending tea samples to customers in small hand-sewn silk pouches instead of tins, purely to cut his own shipping costs. Every single customer mistakenly dunked the entire pouch directly into their boiling water instead of opening it and emptying the tea out first. Sullivan started receiving floods of orders specifically requesting the pouches. His cost-cutting packaging shortcut had accidentally invented the tea bag. One of the most convenient brewing methods in history was created entirely because customers were too impatient to read basic instructions, and Sullivan was too cheap to use tins. 62. Tim Berners-Lee in 1989 built a simple internal document sharing system at CERN purely to help physicists keep track of each other's research notes and contact information. He submitted his proposal to his supervisor with the completely modest title Information Management A Proposal, while his supervisor scrawled across the cover page vague but exciting and handed it back. Berners-Lee kept going anyway. That humble little document tracking system for physicists accidentally became the architectural foundation of the entire World Wide Web. The most transformative communication network in human history started as an internal office organization tool that one supervisor almost dismissed with 4 words. 63. Australian psychiatrist John Cade in 1949 was testing uric acid compounds in guinea pigs as part of his personal theory about the biological causes of mania. He needed to dissolve the compounds in water, so he used lithium salts as a convenient solvent because they were easy to work with. The lithium was purely a practical tool, nothing more. The guinea pigs became unexpectedly and dramatically calm. Cade realized the lithium itself was causing the effect, not the uric acid compounds he was actually studying. Lithium became the foundational treatment for bipolar disorder entirely because a psychiatrist needed a convenient way to dissolve something else. 64. 18-year-old William Perkin in 1856 was attempting to synthesize quinine for malaria treatment in his home laboratory because he was the kind of teenager who had a chemistry lab at home. His coal tar experiment failed completely and left a disgusting reddish-brown sludge coating his flask. When he rinsed the flask with alcohol, it turned a vivid and striking purple. Perkin had accidentally discovered the first-ever synthetic dye. He patented it immediately, built a factory, became wealthy before age 20, and accidentally launched the entire modern chemical and pharmaceutical industry from a failed experiment in his bedroom. 65. When Explorer 1 was launched in 1958, its onboard Geiger counter behaved in a deeply confusing way. Instead of detecting increasing radiation as it climbed higher above Earth, it went completely silent above a certain altitude as if it had simply stopped working. Physicist James Van Allen studied the data carefully and realized the detector was not broken at all. It was so completely overwhelmed by intense radiation that it had fully saturated and could not register any higher. Earth was surrounded by massive invisible belts of trapped high-energy particles that no scientist had ever suspected existed until a malfunctioning-looking instrument revealed them. 66. In 1977, scientists aboard the research submersible Alvin were mapping the ocean floor near the Galapagos Rift when instruments detected unexpectedly warm water in a zone that should have been near freezing and completely lifeless. They descended to investigate and found entire thriving ecosystems of giant tube worms, clams, shrimp, and bacteria clustered around superheated vents on the ocean floor in total permanent darkness with absolutely no sunlight reaching them at all. Every biology textbook ever written assumed sunlight was the foundation of all life on Earth. One warm patch of water on the ocean floor proved every single one of those textbooks wrong. 67. Around 250 BC, King Hero II of Syracuse handed Archimedes a royal headache by asking him to determine whether his new crown was pure gold without melting it down or damaging it in any way. Archimedes stressed over this problem for days. Then he lowered himself into a bath and watched the water level rise, and suddenly, everything clicked. He ran through the streets of Syracuse shouting "Eureka!" wearing nothing at all according to the story. He had discovered water displacement, the foundational principle of fluid mechanics, while getting into a bathtub, and the whole neighborhood apparently heard about it immediately. 68. According to centuries of French tradition, a young shepherd near the village of Roquefort left his lunch of bread and fresh sheep's milk cheese inside a cool cave, and wandered off when he spotted an attractive girl passing nearby. He forgot completely about his lunch and returned weeks later to find his abandoned cheese had transformed entirely. Blue-green penicillin mold had laced through the whole wheel, and it tasted extraordinary. He had invented the world's most famous blue cheese by abandoning his meal to chase a girl. French gastronomy owes one of its greatest achievements to a distracted teenage shepherd with poor lunch supervision skills. 69. In 1957, engineers Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavan sealed two plastic shower curtains together, trapping rows of air bubbles between the layers. And they were absolutely convinced they had invented a revolutionary new, textured wallpaper product for modern American homes. They pitched it enthusiastically to anyone who would listen. Nobody wanted bubbled plastic on their walls under any circumstances. Years later, IBM started using it to protect computers during shipping, and the entire world discovered the deeply satisfying experience of popping the bubbles. Bubble wrap became the world's most beloved packaging material entirely because two men completely failed to sell it as wallpaper first. 70. Bob Gore, in 1969, was trying to stretch heated rods of Teflon slowly and carefully to create affordable wire insulation for computers. After repeatedly failing to get the results he needed, he grabbed a rod in pure frustration and yanked it violently with his full strength. The Teflon suddenly expanded to 800% of its original length and transformed into a breathable yet completely waterproof microporous membrane. Gore recognized immediately what he was holding. That single furious, frustrated yank in a laboratory produced Gore-Tex, the material now lining every serious waterproof jacket, hiking boot, and outdoor gear product sold across America. 71. In the 1980s, ophthalmologist Dr. Jean Carruthers was injecting a patient with botulinum toxin to treat involuntary eye muscle spasms, a completely routine medical procedure she had performed many times before. The patient mentioned casually during the appointment that the skin around her injected eye had become completely smooth and entirely wrinkle-free. Carruthers stopped and looked closely, and she immediately understood the cosmetic implications of what her patient had just offhandedly described. Botox as a wrinkle treatment was discovered entirely because one patient made a casual throwaway comment during a routine eye appointment, and her doctor was smart enough to actually listen. 72. Wallace Carruthers and his team at DuPont in 1935 were studying the chemistry of long-chain polymers when a researcher drew a heated polymer mixture slowly across a laboratory bench on the tip of a glass rod. It stretched into a remarkably thin, strong, silky thread that nobody had seen before. Carruthers suffered from severe depression throughout his career and died in 1937, never knowing what his discovery would become. Nylon stockings launched the following year and sold 64 million pairs in their first 12 months. How the man who invented one of America's most beloved products never lived to see a single pair sold. 73. Carl Jansky at Bell Labs. In 1931 was assigned the unglamorous task of identifying sources of static that were interfering with transatlantic radio telephone calls. He built a large rotating antenna mounted on a wooden frame sitting on repurposed Model T Ford wheels, and spent months tracking down every noise source he could find. After eliminating everything else, he kept getting a persistent hiss that rotated perfectly in sync with the stars overhead. It was coming from the center of the Milky Way galaxy itself. Jansky had accidentally discovered that the universe broadcasts radio waves and founded an entirely new branch of astronomy while hunting telephone static. 74. Victor Hess, in 1912, climbed into a balloon and ascended to 5,300 meters, specifically expecting the radiation readings from his instruments to decrease the higher he got, because everyone assumed radiation came from rocks in the earth below. Instead, his readings increased dramatically the higher the balloon climbed. Radiation was pouring down from outer space in enormous quantities. Hess won the Nobel Prize in 1936 for discovering cosmic rays. He had designed his entire experiment to confirm one thing, got the completely opposite result at every altitude, and accidentally made one of the most significant discoveries in the history of physics. 75. Graduate student Jamie Link at UC San Diego in 2003 was working on a silicon chip in her lab when it unexpectedly shattered into tiny fragments right in front of her. Instead of sweeping up the pieces and starting over, she and her professor examined the fragments and noticed they were still functioning as sensors, despite being microscopic in size. That accidental explosion created the concept of smart dust, programmable microscale particles small enough to travel through the human body. Researchers are now developing smart dust particles capable of detecting tumors from inside the bloodstream. all because a graduate student's chip broke at exactly the right moment. 76. Johannes Gutenberg, in the 1430s, did not invent the screw press from scratch. He was walking past the heavy wooden agricultural screw presses that farmers had used for centuries to crush grapes for wine and olives for oil when the connection suddenly hit him. And the same mechanical principle that squeezed juice from fruit could press ink onto paper with perfect, consistent force. Gutenberg had not invented a new machine at all. He had looked at a grape-crushing farming tool and recognized it was secretly a printing press in disguise. That agricultural observation launched mass communication, literacy, and the entire modern information age. 77. In 1905, 11-year-old Frank Epperson mixed powdered soda with water in a tin cup on his porch in San Francisco and left it outside overnight with a wooden mixing stick standing straight up in it. The temperature dropped below freezing while he slept. By morning, the whole mixture had frozen solid around the stick. He pulled it out and licked it and thought it was the greatest thing he had ever tasted. 18 years passed before he finally patented the idea and called it the popsicle. He then sold the rights away for what turned out to be an almost embarrassingly small amount of money. 78. Noah McVicker, in the early 1950s, developed a soft, non-toxic, doughy compound specifically designed to be sold to housewives for cleaning soot deposits off wallpaper. Then, natural gas heating replaced coal across America, and nobody had soot on their wallpaper anymore. His product had absolutely no market left. His sister-in-law, who taught nursery school, suggested giving the leftover compound to her students as modeling clay instead of throwing it away. McVicker agreed reluctantly. Play-Doh launched commercially in 1956 and has sold over 3 billion cans since then. The failed wallpaper cleaning product became one of the most iconic children's toys in American history. 79. Raymond Damadian, in the early 1970s, was studying basic cell biology and placed tissue samples inside a nuclear magnetic resonance machine to examine them. He noticed that cancerous tissue and completely healthy tissue produced detectably different radio frequency signals under the magnetic field. Damadian had not been trying to build any kind of scanner or diagnostic tool whatsoever. He was simply studying cells. That accidental biological observation became the foundational insight behind MRI scanning technology. Every hospital in America now has at least one MRI machine, and collectively they perform tens of millions of diagnostic scans every single year, tracing back to one unexpected cell biology result. 80. B. Charles Towns in 1951 was so anxious the night before a government committee meeting that he could not sleep and ended up sitting alone on a park bench in Washington, D.C. at 5 in the morning. A thought suddenly struck him about how excited molecules could amplify microwave radiation. He had no paper, so he grabbed a paper bag from his jacket pocket and scrawled the equations right there on it in the dark. That pre-dawn scribble on a paper bag became the maser, the direct technological precursor to the laser. One sleepless night on a park bench accidentally produced the technology behind every laser on Earth. 81. Pfizer was testing a drug called UK-92480 in the early 1990s as a treatment for angina, a painful heart condition where blood vessels constrict. The drug failed to treat angina in any meaningful way during trials. But male participants in Wales kept refusing to return their unused pill supplies at the end of the study and kept reporting a very specific and unexpected side effect with enormous enthusiasm. Pfizer's researchers connected the dots quickly. The failed heart medication was redirected entirely into a new research program. Viagra launched in 1998 and became the fastest-selling pharmaceutical product in history up to that point. 82. Belgian-American chemist Leo Baekeland in 1907 was simply trying to create a cheap synthetic replacement for shellac, an expensive resin that lac bugs in South Asia produced naturally. He combined phenol and formaldehyde under high heat and pressure, expecting something useful but ordinary. What came out was a hard, non-conductive, heat-resistant material that could be molded permanently into absolutely any shape imaginable. Baekeland had accidentally invented the world's first completely synthetic plastic. He named it Bakelite after himself because he had earned that right. Every plastic object manufactured in the 20th century traces its origin directly back to his shellac replacement experiment. 83. Canon engineer Ichiro Endo in 1977 accidentally rested a hot soldering iron against a syringe filled with ink while working at his bench. The heat caused the ink to shoot out of the needle tip in a sudden, precise jet. Endo sat completely still for a moment, processing what he had just witnessed. He realized the same thermal principle could be applied to printing, using heat to fire precise droplets of ink onto paper at high speed. The bubble jet inkjet printer was born from one moment of workplace carelessness. Every inkjet printer sitting in every American home office today exists because of one misplaced soldering iron. 84. Scientists making routine atmospheric measurements over Antarctica in the mid-1970s kept getting ozone readings so shockingly low that every single person on the team assumed their instruments were broken and needed replacing. They ordered brand new instruments and waited. The new instruments returned identical readings. The ozone layer had a massive hole torn through it, caused directly by chlorofluorocarbons, the same chemicals that had been marketed to consumers for decades as the safest, most harmless compounds ever invented. The discovery that humanity had punched a hole in its own planetary shield happened because scientists kept insisting their perfectly accurate instruments must be wrong. 85. Alfred Wegener, in 1912, was not a geologist and had absolutely no business making geological claims. He was a meteorologist sitting at his desk, staring at a world map, when he noticed that the eastern coastline of South America and the western coastline of Africa fit together with extraordinary precision like two torn pieces of the same page. He proposed that all the continents had once been joined together and slowly drifted apart over millions of years. Every professional geologist on Earth publicly mocked him for decades. He died on a Greenland expedition in 1930 and was fully vindicated only after his death. 86. Say British pharmacist John Walker in 1827 was stirring a chemical mixture with a wooden stick in his dispensary in Stockton-on-Tees when he scraped the coated tip against his stone hearth to clean it off. The stick burst immediately into flames. Walker called his invention friction lights and sold them from his pharmacy counter for a penny each. He never bothered to patent the idea, never built a business around it, and never made any serious money from it. He died in complete obscurity while other people copied his invention directly, patented it themselves, and became very wealthy from his unprotected idea. 87. In 1835, Lord Sandys returned to Worcestershire from serving as governor of Bengal and asked local chemists John Lee and William Perrins to recreate a spicy sauce he had fallen in love with during his time in India. Their first attempt smelled terrible and tasted nearly undrinkable. They shoved the barrel into the back of their cellar and forgot about it completely. Over a year later, they rediscovered it while cleaning the cellar and tasted it out of curiosity. Fermentation had transformed it into something complex and deeply extraordinary. Worcestershire sauce has been made continuously using the same basic process every single year since that forgotten barrel was rediscovered. 88. Chemist Patsy Sherman at 3M in 1952 was developing a new rubber material that needed to resist jet fuel without breaking down. During an experiment, a small amount of an experimental fluorochemical compound splashed accidentally onto her laboratory assistant's canvas tennis shoe. Sherman watched as her colleague tried everything available to remove the spot. No solvents worked, no cleaners worked, water beaded straight off it. Nothing could touch it and nothing could penetrate it either. Sherman recognized exactly what she was looking at. Scotchgard fabric protector launched commercially in 1956, and Americans have been spraying it on their furniture and clothing enthusiastically ever since. 89. Stephanie Kwolek, at DuPont in 1965, was developing a lightweight, high-strength fiber to replace heavy steel wire in tires. One experimental polymer solution came out completely cloudy and watery looking, which normally meant the batch had failed and needed to be thrown away immediately. Kwolek was not convinced and asked a technician to spin the solution anyway despite his strong objections that it would damage the equipment. The resulting fiber tested out at 5 times stronger than steel by weight. Kwolek had just created Kevlar. Every bulletproof vest worn by every police officer and soldier in America today exists because she refused to throw out a cloudy batch. 90. Alfred Nobel, the exact same man who invented dynamite using nitroglycerin, later noticed something deeply ironic happening inside his own factories. Workers who handled nitroglycerin daily and also happened to suffer from heart conditions consistently reported that their chest pain improved significantly while they were at work and returned every weekend when they went home. Nobel himself suffered from heart disease and refused to take nitroglycerin for it on principle because of his complicated personal history with the substance. Diluted nitroglycerin relaxes blood vessels and relieves angina. It is still prescribed by cardiologists to heart patients today. 150 years after Nobel accidentally noticed his factory workers feeling better on the job. 91. Autopsies performed on soldiers killed by mustard gas exposure during World War I showed their white blood cell counts had been completely and totally destroyed by the chemical. Decades later, oncologists studying these findings realized that a related compound called nitrogen mustard might be used to target and kill the rapidly dividing cells of cancer tumors. The first chemotherapy drug in history was derived directly from one of the most horrific chemical weapons ever deployed on a battlefield. Medicine found its most powerful cancer-fighting tool hiding inside one of humanity's greatest wartime atrocities. 92. In 1933, scientists at ICI in Britain were running high-pressure chemical reaction experiments when a waxy white solid unexpectedly formed inside their equipment from trace oxygen contamination nobody had planned for. The team looked at it briefly, dismissed it as an irrelevant contaminant, and moved on without investigating further. When the exact same thing happened again in 1935, someone finally decided to examine it properly. That dismissed waxy contamination was polyethylene, now the single most widely produced plastic on Earth. The most common material in modern packaging was discovered twice by the same company and ignored completely the first time around. 93. A French astronomer, Jules Janssen, in 1868, was observing a total solar eclipse in Guntur, India, to study the sun's outer atmosphere when he detected a bright yellow spectral line in the corona that matched absolutely no known element on Earth. British astronomer Norman Lockyer confirmed the finding and named the mystery element helium after Helios, the Greek god of the sun. Nobody could find helium anywhere on Earth at the time because it did not appear to exist here. Helium was discovered in space a full 27 years before scientists finally located it on Earth itself, hiding inside uranium ore. 94. In 1855, French textile merchant Jean-Baptiste Joly came home to find his maid had knocked a kerosene lamp over onto his best tablecloth. He braced for a ruined cloth and an expensive replacement. Instead, the kerosene had dissolved every stain on the fabric and left it cleaner than the surrounding untouched areas of the table. Joly immediately recognized the commercial potential of what his clumsy maid had accidentally demonstrated. He opened the world's very first professional dry cleaning service the following year. An entire global industry serving millions of Americans every week was launched by one knocked-over lamp and one very lucky tablecloth. 95. Herman Rorschach, in 1910, was playing a popular children's parlor game called Klexography, where players made random ink blots by folding paper, purely for his own entertainment after work. He started noticing that different people consistently described the exact same blots in completely different ways, depending on their personality and emotional state. Rorschach spent the next decade carefully developing this casual observation from a parlor game into a standardized psychological diagnostic test. The Rorschach inkblot test is now used in psychiatric clinics, courtrooms, and psychological evaluations across the entire world, all traced back to a grown man playing a children's paper folding game alone after hours. 96. James Wright at General Electric in 1943 was assigned to find a cheap rubber substitute for the American war effort and combined boric acid with silicone oil, expecting a useful practical material. What came out bounced, stretched, snapped when hit sharply, and transferred newspaper ink onto itself when pressed against a page, but was completely useless as rubber in every practical sense. The U.S. government rejected it immediately. Saw a toy salesman named Peter Hodgson package the useless substance in small plastic eggs and sold 2.5 million units within 3 days. A failed wartime rubber replacement became Silly Putty, one of the most beloved American toys ever made. 97. British chemists John Rex Winfield and James Tennant Dixon, in 1941, were reviewing old abandoned research notes left behind by Wallace Carruthers. who had personally discarded a particular polymer years earlier, judging it too low melting to be useful for anything. Instead of accepting Carruthers' conclusion, they decided to investigate the discarded polymer further, just to be thorough. The material they developed from those rejected notes was polyethylene terephthalate, PET plastic, now used in virtually every single drinking bottle, food container, and polyester garment manufactured anywhere on Earth today. Two chemists refusing to trust a dead colleague's rejection note accidentally created the plastic that surrounds American life completely. 98. James Schlatter, at G.D. Searle and Company in 1965 was synthesizing a compound intended as a potential treatment for gastric ulcers when a piece of paper slipped off his laboratory bench. He licked his finger to pick it up without thinking and immediately noticed an intensely and unexpectedly sweet taste on his fingertip. He carefully traced the sweetness back through everything he had been handling and identified a dipeptide compound called aspartame as the source. Schlatter had accidentally discovered the most widely used artificial sweetener in the world. Aspartame is now found in over 6,000 products and consumed by hundreds of millions of people globally every single day. 99. DuPont chemist Arnold Collins in 1930 was distilling the byproducts of a chloroprene experiment when he noticed a strange rubbery solid forming unexpectedly inside his distillation flask. He had not anticipated any solid material forming at all during this particular process. Testing revealed the substance resisted oil, heat, and harsh chemicals far beyond anything natural rubber could handle. Collins had stumbled onto neoprene entirely by accident while cleaning up experimental byproducts. Neoprene now lines every wetsuit worn by American surfers, every laptop sleeve sold in electronics stores, and appears in medical equipment and electrical insulation used in industries across the entire country. On a 100. British ophthalmologist Harold Ridley noticed during World War II that RAF pilots whose eyes had been pierced by fragments of Perspex aircraft canopy did not reject the plastic material the way human eyes always rejected glass fragments. Their eyes simply tolerated the Perspex completely. After the war ended, Ridley spent years thinking about what that observation meant before finally implanting a small-shaped Perspex lens directly inside a human eye to replace a clouded natural lens. He had invented the intraocular lens implant, now used in every single cataract surgery performed anywhere on Earth, inspired entirely by pilots getting plastic shards in their eyes during wartime. 101. Albert Hofmann at Sandoz Laboratories in Basel in 1943 was resynthesizing a compound called lysergic acid diethylamide that he had originally made 5 years earlier and set aside with zero interest. During the synthesis, he accidentally absorbed a tiny quantity through the skin of his fingertips. He began experiencing intense vivid hallucinations and was forced to stop work and cycle home through the streets of Basel in a state of complete chemical chaos. April 19th is still commemorated every year as Bicycle Day by chemists around the world. Hoffman had accidentally discovered LSD while doing routine chemistry homework on a compound he had previously considered completely uninteresting. 102 were French inventor Louis Ducos du Oran in 1869 had no coherent scientific theory of color photography and no master plan whatsoever. And he simply tried layering 3 separate photographic exposures taken through red, yellow, and blue filters and combining them together to see what happened. The result showed recognizable color. Du Oran had independently stumbled onto the trichromatic principle of color reproduction that now underpins every color photograph, every color television screen, and every color printer ever manufactured. The entire world of color imaging traces back to one man with no theory, just randomly stacking colored filters on top of each other to see what came out. 103. In 1906, Danish philologist Johann Ludwig Heiberg was examining what appeared to be a completely unremarkable medieval prayer book held in a library in Constantinople. He noticed faint diagrams and unusual text visible beneath the overwritten religious content on several pages. Medieval monks had scraped ancient manuscript pages clean and reused the expensive vellum to write prayers over the top. Under ultraviolet light, the erased original text revealed 2 previously unknown works by Archimedes, including his most advanced mathematical thinking, hidden completely under 800 years' worth of prayers. The greatest mathematical rediscovery in history was buried inside a prayer book nobody had looked at carefully enough. 104. Christopher Columbus, in 1492, sailed southwest from the Canary Islands with absolute confidence. He was heading directly toward Japan and China by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. He landed instead on an island in the Bahamas and spent the rest of his life genuinely convinced he had reached the outer islands of Asia. He died without ever accepting that he had found something else entirely. Columbus had made the most consequential navigational error in all of human history and permanently connected the Old World and the New World entirely by accident while stubbornly looking for a completely different destination on the wrong side of the planet. 105. In 1895, a physician named Emil van Ermengem was investigating a botulism outbreak in Belgium after musicians at a funeral feast became severely ill from eating improperly cured ham. He isolated the bacterial toxin responsible for paralyzing their muscles during that investigation. Now, nobody imagined at the time that this deadly paralyzing toxin would ever have any medical use whatsoever. Over a century later, that same toxin in microscopic controlled doses became Botox, treatments for cerebral palsy, migraine prevention therapy, and excessive sweating treatment. A poisoned funeral feast in Belgium accidentally gave the world one of its most versatile and widely used medical treatments. 106. Bell Labs. Physicist Walter Brattain in December 1947 was experimenting with a germanium semiconductor immersed in water when he accidentally placed two gold contacts extremely close together on the surface of the germanium while adjusting his setup. The device suddenly amplified the electrical signal passing through it in a way nothing had done before. See, Brattain called his colleague William Shockley into the lab immediately. The transistor had just been born from one misplaced gold contact sitting in a water bath. Every computer, every smartphone, every electronic device on Earth contains transistors, and every single one of them traces directly back to that one accidental placement. 107. Scottish obstetrician James Young Simpson, in 1847, gathered two colleagues at his dinner table one evening after work, and they spent the night inhaling different chemical compounds from saucers purely out of scientific curiosity because apparently that was a normal Tuesday night activity for Victorian scientists. When they inhaled chloroform, all three men collapsed unconscious onto the dining room floor and woke up cheerfully some minutes later with no memory of falling. Simpson began using chloroform as a surgical anesthetic immediately the following week. It became the dominant anesthetic used in operating rooms across the world for the next 50 years after one very unusual dinner party. 108. Emil Grubby was a 21-year-old student at Hahnemann Medical College in Chicago in 1896 who had been experimenting with X-ray tubes as a personal hobby in his spare time. He noticed his hands were becoming badly inflamed and his hair was falling out from repeated exposure. A physician colleague watching him one day suggested that if X-rays were destroying his healthy tissue, they might also be capable of destroying diseased tissue inside cancer patients. Grubby immediately began treating a woman with inoperable breast cancer using X-ray radiation. And he had invented radiation therapy before any scientist on Earth had a working theory to explain why it worked. 109. Tang Dynasty Chinese alchemists in the 9th century were methodically mixing sulfur charcoal and saltpeter together in a systematic search for an immortality elixir that would grant eternal life. The mixture ignited with shocking violence, burned off one alchemist's beard and hands, and burned his entire laboratory to the ground. The alchemists noted carefully in their written records that this particular combination of ingredients was one to avoid in future experiments. Their failed immortality search had accidentally produced gunpowder, the most transformative military technology in human history. See, the quest for eternal life accidentally created the very thing that would end so many lives across centuries of warfare. 110. French mathematician Urbain Le Verrier in 1846 had never once looked through a telescope to search for anything. He was sitting at a desk doing pure mathematics, analyzing tiny unexplained wobbles in the orbital path of Uranus that existing calculations could not account for. He determined mathematically that an unknown planet had to exist at a very precise location and sent the exact coordinates by letter to the Berlin Observatory. Astronomer Johann Galle pointed his telescope at the specified location that same night. and Neptune was sitting exactly there. An entire planet was discovered without a single direct observation, purely through mathematics performed at a writing desk. 111. Auguste Kekulé in 1865 had been struggling for years to understand how 6 carbon atoms in benzene could possibly be arranged given that carbon normally forms straight chains. One evening, he dozed off in his chair by the fireplace and dreamed of atoms dancing in long chains that suddenly curled around and formed a snake biting its own tail. He woke instantly and worked through the entire night developing the ring structure of benzene from that single dream image. Kekulé had solved one of the central problems of organic chemistry, sitting in a chair by a fire half asleep. Sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when you stop trying so hard. So next time you make a mess, forget something, or completely fail at what you were trying to do, just remember that accidents literally built the modern world. Every discovery in this video happened because somebody had no idea what they were doing. Now tell me in the comments which accidental discovery blew your mind the most. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to watch dumb history. The next video is on your screen right now, and trust me, you are not ready for it.